Flying has been a big part of my life, but since it nearly killed me, things are a little different. Paragliding was the best way to independently explore the world, and a glider is the ultimate flying machine. But what about hang gliding? I flew paragliders for 15 years, independently exploring mountains all over the world. Paragliders are really slow aircraft, but you can take off and land just about anywhere, which means that you can get to some pretty special places. It's a magical wing in a backpack that you can take with you anywhere, and if you make good decisions and read the weather, you can really have amazing adventures. When the pandemic started, I decided it was finally time to learn gliding. Like paragliders, in the right weather you can fly without a motor for most of the day, but in these performance machines you will go a lot further. They also allow you to fly in a much wider range of conditions and to actually go where it looks good and still get back home again. Last year I moved to Europe and I did some gliding, including a mini comp in the French Alps, where in the first task I flew for 7 hours. Some paragliding, including a beautiful flight across the Carpathians back to my girlfriend's place. And a really fun hike and fly competition in Annecy. It was here, just a few weeks later, that I had the accident that put me in a wheelchair. I have no memory of the crash, but I remember flying my paraglider that day after camping in the mountains with my mates. I've flown in lots of demanding conditions over the years, but there was nothing especially risky about the situation that day. It's just a risky sport. But over a year later, I found out from the investigation that, in fact, the rescue helicopter, blowing me 50 metres down to the next cliff, probably caused the most damage. Life is different as a paraplegic, disabled from the waist down. Slowly I've got a little bit of function back, and there's always the chance of medical advancements, but I don't want to focus everything on what I can't do. I've had really amazing support from family and friends. Lucky enough to have New Zealand citizenship, I did my rehabilitation there, and then my mate, who I flew with on the day of the crash, hosted me and my girlfriend for a few months in Australia, where I returned back to my old job as a meteorologist. It was just a temporary contract though, because I wanted to return to Europe. The same people I stayed with last year hosted me in a cottage in the French Alps. From there I hitchhiked to my old gliding club, which just so happens to cater to disabled pilots with modified hand rudder gliders. Partly because I don't have memory of the accident, and I don't regret doing something wrong, I don't have a fear of flying. It was just so great to get back in the mountains again. I still had to finish my European gliding licence, but I was told the hardest part would be getting my Class 2 medical. We decided to do this in Spain. The club there has been very supportive. One of their members, paralysed 20 years ago, she went to the Supreme Court to make the authorities allow paraplegics to fly. In Europe, all pilots have to do a Class 2 medical to fly solo, but as a paraplegic, this is simply an administrative nonsense that went from one drama to the next. After 6 months, I was finally able to complete it by getting in and out of a glider for the government agency examiners, something I'd done dozens of times before and that only takes 10 minutes. It is really sad to me how gliding, which seems like the perfect sport for paraplegic pilots, is really being killed by these pointless rules. We may have a physical disability, but the real paralysis comes from bureaucracy. It's not only the medical, but the certification requirements for gliders with hand controls that limits our options. In a similar way, I've not been allowed to drive a car, even though I bought a hand control kit online for a few $100. To get a licence here in Spain is the epitome of dysfunctional bureaucracy. Trying to book a non-existent CETA appointment. If I had to name the biggest psychological strains of this injury, I would put this, because it should be completely preventable. Is there another way? Paragliding used to be the ultimate form of adventure for me, and as far as aviation goes, it's relatively unregulated. Mostly, you're just concerned about the laws of nature. Gliding is definitely a more grown-up kind of sport, and I think it's the ultimate flying experience, although with a few limits on freedom. The club environment is ideal for paraplegics, since everyone helps each other anyway, and it's normal to end the day back at the airfield. Some have asked me if I'd get back into paragliding, and while it's possible, I don't think it's a good fit. I can't take off and land in the mountains by myself, and the performance is terrible. But what else is there? Hang gliding is an old sport, somewhere between the performance of gliding and the convenience of paragliding. There are now a couple of options that I'm looking at. Firstly, there's the 3-axis control hang gliders, basically like gliders but so lightweight that they're in another category, escaping regulation. Secondly, there's the weight shift hang gliders, like the electric trike. Really, the decision comes down to what is important for your situation. So let's take a look. Getting my medical has been a diabolical drama, but the gliding community has been great, and I'll still go gliding in Europe. But that limits me to flying out of an airfield, so it's a bit less of an adventure. So that leads us to our first requirement: self-launch capability. Gliders are usually towed by an aeroplane, or in my French club, by a winch. All the club gliders are pure, which means they have no engine. Sometimes you can't find lift, but usually you can. No motor, no worries. Some gliders have a sustainer motor, which is powerful enough to keep you in the air and fly you back home if the lift runs out. And a few can self-launch, but it's expensive. In terms of maintenance and safety, I would never want an internal combustion engine with moving parts, vibration and fluids on my wing. Thank you. Electric is the way to avoid all of that, but it has less grunt, so you need to optimise things. In that sense, the archaeopteryx looks like a great option. The electric trike is less of a performance machine, it seems, but a cheaper option. I really like the sensation and challenge of finding lift in nature, so I'm not as enthusiastic about flying around powered by a loud motor, but I should give it a try. Maybe like the e-glide competitions, where you have a quota of battery energy to use during a race, it could be fun to fly with a combination of battery and nature's power. The next requirement is stowage. Being able to land somewhere else and fly back the next day isn't much use if you can't take anything with you. Gliders are designed primarily to be sleek performance machines and aren't necessarily very practical. Normally glider pilots land back home, but Matthew Scutter has been groundbreaking in the gliding community by gliding to the Australian outback for days at a time, landing at regional airports and recharging his battery overnight at the pub. He has used every last inch of his limited cockpit space to house a few essentials, not much more than a toothbrush. The wheelchair is somewhat unwieldy, but this option online looked pretty interesting. I've always been looking to do things the easy way, for example, using a hammock instead of a stand-up frame, and I think even without a chair I might manage for a few days. Independently transferring myself out onto the grass to set up a tent seems a lot easier than from a glider. The thing about these trips is you can't have too much comfort, as you have to look forward to getting back to something. The Archaeopteryx flies a bit like a paraglider, but with extra performance. I really like being able to fly being part of nature, hearing the waterfalls, the birds singing, and the animals dashing up the slope. The best part about being slow is that it really opens up your options for takeoffs and landings, not needing as much room. Keep a safe landing reachable without relying on the motor, but worst case, an inconvenient landing isn't life or death. A definite advantage of a paraglider is the airframe is somewhat disposable. It has no inertia in a crash. It can usually be fixed by sticky tape and tying some knots. Most glider damage is caused during handling on the ground, and basically the cost of ownership is like buying a new paraglider every year. The Archaeopteryx can be de-rigged into a trailer without too much trouble, and this seems like a reasonable way to go for me. Given the lightweight nature, it should be easier than de-rigging a glider, organising a hangar doesn't make that much sense, as the objective is to be mobile and explore, otherwise why not own a glider? So what would I want to do with a hang glider? I'd still like to go gliding with my club in the French Alps in the summer when it's too hot in Spain. Fly with the Spanish club as well. It does seem like a great place over winter. There is a great airfield near where I live in Valencia where I could keep the hang glider before migrating north for the hotter months. Of course, I'd like to do some exploring in Europe, flying mountains and even flats beyond the Alps, and this could be done with local missions before moving the trailer to the next location. A dream mission would be to follow the next Red Bull X-Alps from the air. This, the most famous of hike and fly races, has several turn points associated with race sponsors along the way, often in the valley. That's not so convenient for pilots. I used to hate it, but it would be ideal for me to base myself as the race goes on. With some extra speed, I should be able to go from one pilot to the next, but being still rather small and light, I'd have similar experiences to them in the air. The electric motor would help fill in the gaps, allowing me to check out some of the early morning glides in the vicinity without needing to find lift. Finally, I would love to bring the hang glider back to New Zealand. When I was there after my accident, I would see the mountains from below and remember my adventures up there. And it would be great to revisit those places, always with a safe glide out to the flats. It's another place where the gliding can be amazing, but it can be a long way to get back to Marama. I'd love to be able to start and finish missions from the hay paddock across the road from Mum's place and have the option of landing in different spots during spells of good weather. I love the spontaneity of paragliding, where you can check the forecast, book flights and off you go. And don't worry about accommodation because you can set up a tent in the bush. These days, with the accident, I have to plan ahead a little more, but I'm really excited about the possibilities for the future.